Hello, welcome to the Live to 110 podcast. My name is Wendy Myers, and you can find me at live to110.com. And you can find this video podcast on my YouTube channel, Wendy Live to 110. You can also learn all about my healing and detox program at mineralpower.com. Today we have Dr. Tim Jackson on the podcast today. He's going to be talking about chronic fatigue and the underlying causes of fatigue. There are so many people out there today suffering from low energy levels or have chronic fatigue syndrome, and we're going to be talking about all of the underlying causes and the remedies and the system that Dr. Tim Jackson uses to reverse chronic fatigue. Please keep in mind that this program is not intended to diagnose or treat any disease or health condition. It's solely informational in nature and for entertainment purposes only. Please consult your healthcare practitioner before engaging in any treatment that we suggest today on the show. And if you guys, anyone of you guys out there are suffering from chronic fatigue, you can go to my website and download my Limitless Energy eGuide. It gives a lot of, a few clues as to the underlying reasons that people today have chronic fatigue and are always tired and always looking to drink coffee all day long or 5-hour energy or whatever their drug du jour is. So go to my website, live to110.com. You'll see the little icon for the Limitless Energy eGuide, and you can download it for free. Our guest, Tim Jackson, DPT, he's a doctorate of physical therapy, received his undergraduate degree in health science and chemistry from Wake Forest University in 2003. He completed his doctorate in physical therapy from the Medical University of Southern Carolina in 2009. And realizing that manual therapy and orthopedic care helped only some of his patients, he began studying functional and environmental medicine as well as digestive health in an effort to help others achieve wellness. Dr. Tim is educated in nutritional biochemistry, functional endocrinology, as well as digestive health and its systemic effects. He recently completed the spine portion of the active release technique methodology, a system that addresses musculoskeletal trigger points and helps to expedite the healing process. Tim, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me, Wendy. I look forward to it.
Why don't you tell the listeners a little bit more about yourself and how you got into the health field?
Yeah, so I'm Dr. Tim Jackson. I finished my doctorate in physical therapy and rehab in 2009, and I've been studying functional medicine for about the past 12 to 13 years, some under different MDs, some under, continuing ed courses, but mostly where I learned the best stuff was through self-study. But I started out in undergrad at Wake Forest University in North Carolina, and I got interested in nutrition and exercise while I was there. And so the medical doctors, the medical school said, you should consider other programs because you're not going to get a lot of nutrition and exercise. And I had a pretty traumatic surgery during the senior year or my senior year of undergrad. And when I came out of that surgery, I basically didn't recover very well. I had candida overgrowth, toxic metals, reactions to anesthesia, and just didn't heal properly. So, I kind of bounced around looking for a doctor who could help me. And about 2 or 2.5 years later, I found an integrative ear, nose, and throat doctor who diagnosed me with candida, heavy metals, and, that he treated me for those. And that certainly helped. But I, continued to learn, and I knew there was more going on underneath the surface. So then I started exploring, functional endocrinology and functional gastroenterology and looking at how those factors play into health or illness and disease. So when I graduated with my doctorate in physical therapy and rehab, it's kind of the same thing as a chiropractor. You do a lot of manual therapy with your hands, but you realize that, if you can balance the body internally, a lot of these external manifestations suddenly start to disappear. A common example is, people with frozen shoulder that cannot move their shoulder at all. They typically come to a doctor of physical therapy for 3 times a week for 2 to 3 months. But if you check them for subclinical hypothyroidism, they almost always come up positive. And if you correct that imbalance, they'll probably get better within weeks. And so I realized quickly that I could do more without my hands than I could with my hands. So I've just continued to study functional medicine since then. I incorporate epigenetics into my practice a lot. I work with a lot of clients with biotoxin-related illness, so mold and Lyme and co-infections, etc., hormonal imbalances, and also work with a lot of kids on the autism spectrum.
Mm. Yeah, and so we're going to talk today on the show about chronic fatigue, because I think
Yeah.
a lack of energy is one of the biggest issues that people are seeking to correct. They want more energy, but more importantly, there's a lot of people out there that have chronic fatigue that have been exhausted for years, and they go to doctor
Mhm.
after doctor after doctor, and they are not helped. So why don't you talk a little bit about what exactly chronic fatigue is? What is the definition of that?
Yeah, so you can have chronic fatigue and not have chronic fatigue syndrome or chronic fatigue immune deficiency syndrome. It's defined as, not being rejuvenated by rest or malaise that has lasted longer than 6 months in origin. So plenty of people have chronic fatigue when they overdo it at the gym and they're working 12-hour days, things like that. But chronic fatigue syndrome or chronic fatigue immune deficiency syndrome is a neuroendocrine immune imbalance in the body where you see a lot of hormonal imbalances, particularly low cortisol or extremely high cortisol. You tend to see a lot of brain abnormalities, gray matter changes on MRIs or functional MRIs or SPECT scans. You see a lot of GI, gastrointestinal infections, whether it's Giardia or another parasite or just an overgrowth of commensal bacteria. You tend to see these poisons, these little molecular poisons getting released into the bloodstream. One that your readers are probably familiar with, or listeners are, is lipopolysaccharides that are released from gram-negative bacteria. They get into the bloodstream, and they eventually cause a leaky blood-brain barrier. So then you get activation of the resident immune system in the brain, which are the microglial cells and the astrocytes. And when those microglia become activated, you become more sensitized to pain, hence the fibromyalgia, musculoskeletal part. But you also develop issues with brain fog, concentration, sleep, all of those issues. There's usually a pretty heavy component of stealth pathogens, whether it's a group of viruses, Lyme, Bartonella, Babesia, Mycoplasma. They all tend to kind of come together. A lot of times you'll see low immune cell counts, especially natural killer cell counts. So, it's a multifactorial issue, and, it's not as simple as linear as saying, okay, you have problem A, you're going to take product B, and that's going to get you to result C. Within the functional medicine model, we have all those circles that are, interacting, and every system influences every other system. There can be any sort of stressor that triggers chronic fatigue syndrome. Those stressors can be infectious stressors, emotional stressors, overworking, adrenal exhaustion, any type of, stressor, whether it's external or internal, can trigger, these neuroendocrine immune imbalances that, if the stress persists for long enough, you'll develop, those, relatively permanent changes until you have some sort of therapeutic intervention.
Mm-hmm. And what about heavy metals and chemicals? What role do those play in chronic fatigue?
Yeah, they play a big role, not just heavy metals, but toxic metals. So, for example, aluminum is technically not a heavy metal, but it's a toxic one. Aluminum, mercury, cadmium, lead, they play a huge component because they basically poison our enzyme systems. And every biochemical reaction that happens in the body has to take place with an enzyme. So if our enzymes stop working, our tissues and eventually our organ systems stop working. One way to kind of prevent that is if you have enough of the good minerals like zinc and magnesium, it occupies the same binding sites on those enzymes. So it makes it, if you're exposed to mercury or aluminum, it's a little harder for it to be as detrimental to you. So you can protect yourself to some degree. But the metals play a big role. They can disrupt mitochondrial function. And when we look at the mitochondria, the batteries of the cells, they're definitely deficient and not working properly in chronic fatigue syndrome. That can be from a number of things. They are very sensitive to oxidative stress. So if you have a lot of free radicals in your body that are kind of unchecked and without enough antioxidants to kind of protect the mitochondria, you'll develop, mitochondrial insufficiencies. And microbes, especially pathogens, can cause what's called a microbial mitochondriopathy, where the cytokine storm and these pro-inflammatory molecules that are released from the immune system damage the mitochondria. And every system in the body, from your heart to your liver to your digestive tract to your brain, relies on ATP. So if you have a mitochondrial abnormality, then it tends to affect every system of the body. And so, the solution for that is to, work on, at the appropriate time, getting rid of the metals, but also the environmental chemicals. There's, numerous ones that poison the mitochondria. And mold, I know we're going to talk about that later, but mycotoxins from mold, not only do they get inside the cell, but they get into the mitochondria, and they can cause permanent, irreversible DNA damage to the mitochondrial DNA.
Wow.
So you have a number of chemicals and heavy metals that disrupt hormones. They can interfere with insulin sensitivity, occupy thyroid hormone receptors, create estrogen dominance, the whole cascade of things. So they definitely play a big role in chronic fatigue syndrome.
I find in my client population that I'm finding everyone has aluminum toxicity. Every single client that I test via hair mineral analysis or urine metals push testing have aluminum. They have arsenic, most of them, and many of them have tin, and they also have thallium. Thallium is found in smog. It's added to gasoline to prevent knocking in cars. You're going to find that in polluted cities. And these particular metals poison enzymes that take nutrients into the mitochondria, so you can't make ATP. And these are actually fairly easily detoxed with BioSil, with silica. Those grab onto that and chelate those. But so what are your favorite methods of detox? Because we know that one of the main underlying causes of chronic fatigue is these toxic metal and chemical poisoning. Because everyone without exception has some degree of chemicals and toxins, and some people are more sensitive to than others to these toxins. So what are your favorite methods of detox to rid the body of these metals and chemicals?
Well, I usually start with gut health, because most people don't realize this, but in a normal, healthy digestive tract, most of the metals should come out through the stool versus through the kidneys. That's phase 3 transport, phase 3 detox transport out of the body. When there's malabsorption or inflammation in the gut and in the colon, it shifts the stress of detoxing metals from the GI tract to the kidneys. That's one reason why people have altered BUN creatinine ratios. So just by correcting dysbiosis, healing the gut mucosa, and facilitating that phase 3 transport, that automatically helps you, have more frequent bowel movements, healthier bowel movements, and you're going to excrete more metals through the bowels. If that phase 3 is turned off or interfered with, it in turn turns around and turns off phase 2 and phase 1 detox in the liver. So then you just have a huge backup of all the toxins that are produced externally and internally. And so by correcting, the gut abnormalities, you automatically take some of that stress off the liver, because you have that portal vein circulation that goes directly from the gut to the liver. So if you have, say, too many gram-negative bacteria, they're going to overload phase 1 detox in the liver by producing lipopolysaccharides. So the gut, optimizing that is step number 1. Then replenishing good minerals, like you mentioned, silica for aluminum detox, magnesium, zinc. Those are some of my most efficient methods for detoxing my patients' bodies from various things. And then I also use some German biological medicine techniques, different drainage remedies that work on the extracellular matrix. A lot of people don't understand the extracellular matrix and how when it gets congested, nutrients don't get into the cell and toxins don't get out of the cell. So some drainage remedies which tend to be gentler, on the body than a hardcore detox, because, if you've never detoxed before and you just go in and start taking all these chelating agents, you're going to find yourself in a mess. You're going to move the metals around a lot. You're going to stir up various microbes and can really sort of knock you backwards for a while. So I never even test people for a provocation heavy metal test until like we've worked on a lot of stuff, because I don't want them to have a setback, with the metals. And I know they're going to have them. It's just a matter of how much. So I also use, dry skin brushing, sauna. There's a machine called a chi machine that kind of vibrates your body that helps move the lymphatic fluid. If your lymphatic system's congested, it's going to be hard for your immune cells to get where they need to go. So there's, manual lymphatic drainage, rebounding, all those different methods help. Any sort of resistance training exercise helps to push the lymphatic fluid, move it throughout the body. And I think the lymphatic system and the extracellular matrix are probably two of the most ignored areas of detox.
Yeah, and so you mentioned saunas. You mean infrared saunas?
Yeah, far infrared saunas.
Okay. Yeah, and can you talk a little about those and how they assist detox?
Yeah, so far infrared saunas, it's sending a wave that, is not visible to the human eye deeper into the tissues. And so you're mobilizing toxins that get stored a lot of times in fat tissue. So your body, stores these lipid-soluble toxins in the fat tissue to protect your internal organs from damage. So when you heat up the body, the enzymes, all of your enzymes start to work better. You start to process these metabolites and these toxins better. Some will come through the skin.
So why are so many today suffering from chronic fatigue?
Well, the average newborn that comes into the world, based on a study that looked at, I think, 8 or 9 U.S. cities, on the average umbilical cord has between 200 and 250 known carcinogens. So we're coming into the world toxic. In utero, we're getting a lot of toxins dumped into babies. So they're kind of starting out, toxic in the world. Then, you throw in a little bit of antibiotics here and there, just 1 or 2 rounds. You disrupt the gut flora. That's going to affect phase 2 detox, phase 1 detox, and phase 3. If you're not born vaginally, you don't get that initial burst of good bacteria. You need to make sure that you're supplementing your baby with probiotics. So that can, interfere with the microbiome as well. But like I said, you can make up for it with supplementation and dietary stuff. And all those things, factor into a child kind of starting out toxic in the world. And then, you look at the problem of things like infections. They can be passed unknowingly from mother to baby in utero, and the blood-brain barrier doesn't really form until about age 4 or 5. So a virus, a neurotropic virus that likes to get in the brain and cause all sorts of dysfunction, has a far greater, more serious impact on children than it does on adults, because they don't have that protection yet. So those pathogens that certainly play a role. And there's actually a couple studies that show that if the mother has too many gram-negative bacteria in her GI tract, it's going to produce too many lipopolysaccharides, those inflammatory compounds. And what that does is that depletes the baby's glutathione in the brain. And so that is a major risk factor for autism and or autism spectrum disorders. When you couple that with, the conventional or standard American diet, the number of chemicals listed, that we can't pronounce. Our liver literally, is trying to deal with everything we're eating, and half of it, it can't even recognize. So, pretty much everyone, I think, can benefit from some form of liver support, just from the external environmental toxins you're exposed to. Even if you're eating organic, you're going to get some contamination here and there. So I think all those factors are contributing. I think Americans, overwork or tending to overwork, that definitely plays a role. And, having a facilitated hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis that kind of constantly stays on, you're stuck or locked in that sympathetic dominant state, and you can't switch back to the parasympathetic state for the healing and regeneration that you need. And so it's hard for the body to switch into that anabolic or tissue building state.
Yeah, I agree with you that, our children are being born very vulnerable today because we're being born with so many toxins. And I'm finding younger and younger clients that are teenagers or in their 20s that have been exhausted for years and can't fully participate in their life. And part of that is because a lot of children today are being born like what's called burnout babies, where they're being born with adrenal fatigue and born with just completely loaded with chemicals, and their bodies just and their brains can't form correctly.
Right. Yeah, I agree 100%. They're coming into the world, loaded with toxins, and those chemicals interfere with development in ways we still don't know. And the way our system works is basically, we'll release a new synthetic chemical, and then we'll wait and see if it damages anything, and then we'll retract it if it does, instead of doing the proper safety testing on things.
Yeah,
So I
and
think that
there's
plays a role.
yeah, there's 80,000 plus chemicals in the environment. Some estimates are upwards of 100,000, and there's almost zero testing on human safety for these
Right.
chemicals. And there's
Right.
thousands more coming out every year.
Yeah, and so it's extremely important to keep the gut, the liver supported. Far infrared sauna can help. Certain toxins you can sweat out. But even if you don't sweat the toxins out, by raising your body temperature, you also improve your immune function. And so if you're fighting infections, pathogens hate heat. So the more you can heat up your body, the more efficient your immune cells become, not just in number, but in their activity level as well.
Yeah.
So that can be pretty helpful.
Yeah, and that's why I'm a huge advocate of infrared sauna use. There's so many, many benefits, and that's also why I developed my liver rehab supplement, because I think people today, our livers are really suffering, and because they're so overloaded and overburdened, they need assistance, extra amino acid help, maybe some herbal help to be able to function better. But let's talk about stealth infections. You talked a little
Yeah,
bit about those earlier. What are they, and what is their role in chronic fatigue?
excuse me. Well, stealth infections basically just means that they have evolved methods to evade the immune response or to alter the immune response in some way. Certain viruses, like Epstein-Barr virus, is a common cause of Hashimoto's because it tricks the body into attacking the thyroid. Lyme bacteria, when it comes on board, it turns off the humoral or B cell immunity. So it's stealth because it comes on board, it turns off the immune system, and then it allows itself to propagate. It also has evolved methods to change the proteins on the outer surface of its coating so that they can disguise themselves from immune cells. So if an immune cell is passing a Lyme bacteria, they may not even recognize it as something detrimental. So that's why they're stealth. That, and they can hide in various tissues. Certain viruses I mentioned earlier, like human herpes virus 6, cytomegalovirus virus, Coxsackie B virus, mycoplasma, which is a cell wall deficient bacteria. All of those are very common to see. You rarely see just one. You'll tend to see at least two or three together that are elevated. Part of the problem is recognition. Even a lot of functional doctors think that you have to have an elevated IgM titer to that specific pathogen for it to be a current infection, but that's not true. If the IgG level is high enough, it can indicate a current infection. So, getting on antivirals or antifungals or antibiotics, nutraceutical, whatever, can certainly help that process along.
And so let's talk a little bit more about Lyme, because I automatically think that any client coming to me, they've been exhausted for years or even decades. Automatically, I think Lyme and Lyme's co-infections like Bartonella and other things, some of the ones that you mentioned already. Can you talk a little bit about Lyme and how it causes chronic fatigue?
Yeah, well, it does it through a few different methods. Typically, you're going to have heavy metals along with it, and also biofilm, which the pathogens create to hide from the immune system. But it creates a ton of oxidative stress, and that oxidative stress interferes with mitochondrial functioning. So you get decreased ATP output. typically, along with the infections, you'll have heavy metals, like you mentioned, mercury and things like that, that also slow down mitochondrial function. And then if you throw in some gut issues, that's going to lead to liver detox issues. It leads to hormonal imbalances, cytokines, those pro-inflammatory cytokines that are released from the immune cells. They can damage your hormone receptors and damage or alter hormone levels. So you get a lot of downstream effects where, initially you may have high cortisol and low DHEA, and then that's going to suppress your secretory IgA in the gut, so your gut mucosal immunity is shut down. So then you start getting more gut infections. It also lowers a hormone called alpha MSH, or alpha melanocyte stimulating hormone. And that hormone, it controls some downstream sex hormones, but it also controls sleep and your natural endogenous opioids. So if that hormone is low, it'll affect your sleep quality, your downstream hormone levels, which play a role in energy, and it'll affect your ability to control inflammation. And if you're inflamed, you're going to be tired. So that inflammation, turns into oxidative stress, which, further can damage the mitochondria, but can also damage the cell membranes. And if you have dysfunctional cell membranes, the cells don't communicate, and then the tissues don't work, and then the organs don't work. So it disrupts a lot of different pathways in the body, from the mitochondria to hormonal pathways. And, it turns on the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis and kind of keeps it on, because your body doesn't have a way to differentiate between, getting stuck in traffic type stressor and an infectious stressor. It's all the same. It's all the same stressor. And so your body's constantly fighting something. So your adrenals, someone may have, adrenal fatigue, but what factors are activating the adrenals? So that's where you get into looking at the co-infections, the Lyme, viruses, mold, all of those things, and try to, gradually address each one so that the adrenals aren't constantly, activated.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point because, a lot of people blame themselves. It's their lifestyle, or they try to get plenty of sleep, and they try to take vitamin C and ashwagandha and do all these things to try to heal their adrenals. But they got adrenal fatigue not just because of their lifestyle or their guzzling caffeine, but it's also because people have a lot of people have chronic infections, and they have heavy metal and chemical toxicities, or adrenals trying to rep at their metabolism to try to push that stuff out, and all these other things you talk about, gut infections. These all rev up that sympathetic nervous system and promote adrenal fatigue, and then crashes, and then chronic fatigue. It's this domino effect.
Right, exactly right.
And so let's talk about methylation. You do a lot of epigenetic stuff in your practice. What can you define methylation just for any of the newbies that aren't aware of that, and what role that plays in chronic fatigue?
Sure. So methylation is actually not just one reaction. It's over 100 different biochemical reactions. It takes place in every cell in the body. And it's the donation of a methyl group, which is simply a carbon atom attached to 3 hydrogen atoms. And, carbon is an extremely important molecule for all of our biochemical reactions. So these methyl groups, things that can get methylated, are neurotransmitters, hormones, cells, cell membranes. But methylation overall is important because, A, that's partly how you produce glutathione, which is important for detoxification, to protect the mitochondria from oxidative stress, and to fight off viruses. Glutathione is a natural antiviral. Methylation also impacts your brain chemicals or neurotransmitters. So serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine can all be impacted, if you're not methylating properly. So that can have domino effects from the neurotransmitters to the hormones, to gut motility and things of that nature. And so all of those, I think, can contribute in making someone feel, like something's wrong or something's a little off. But methylation also plays a role in myelination. So the fatty coating that goes around our nerves is made through the methylation cycle. And methylation is also partly how we make carnitine and CoQ10, those substrates that the batteries or the mitochondria use for energy. So, a lot of people take CoQ10 and carnitine, and that's fine. But if you optimize methylation, you'll naturally produce more on your own as well.
Mm-hmm. And how do
And
you?
so, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Methylation, has a lot of people will email and say, well, I have this disorder. Is methylation playing a role? And the answer is almost always yes, but it may be direct or it may be indirect.
Mm-hmm. And so, how do you go about correcting people's methylation? I know it's probably not a simple question. Everyone's so
Yeah,
different.
well, part of it is just starting out controlling inflammation and calming down oxidative stress. Because oxidative stress turns off a lot of the good genes and turns on a lot of the bad genes. And so, you can't just say, okay, I'm going to take methylfolate and B12 and, I'm done with it. So, I generally start people working on the adrenals and the gut kind of at the same time. And then I gradually start layering in the minerals like magnesium and zinc since they're needed as cofactors. And then what I'll do is I'll layer in the other B vitamins, thiamine, riboflavin, niacinamide. And then the last thing that I add in is our B12 and methylfolate. If you take B12 and methylfolate and you have a lot of oxidative stress, it creates peroxynitrite, which is damaging to cells. So that's why a lot of people will take B12 and folate to begin with, and they feel bad. And so, it's important to kind of do things at the right time and the right sequence.
Mm-hmm. And so, let's talk a little bit about the prevalence of mold toxicity, and let's just go into more detail about that and how that promotes fatigue.
Yeah, so mold, there's, over several hundred species of mold. A lot of people think the only harmful one is the black mold, the Stachybotrys, but that's not true. And another myth is that, it's only older homes that have mold. Actually, what happens is the newer homes are sometimes more likely than the older homes to have it because they build them to be so energy efficient. There's not a good exchange between indoor and outdoor air, and that leads to less competition for the mold and mycotoxins that are inside your house. And so when you add that to, if you've had a flood or leak, or you live in a high humidity area, all of those things contribute. So mold toxicity, is a very common problem, and you don't have to see it, you don't have to smell it for it to be there. There are, two tests that I recommend that people can order on their own. One is called a Hertz Me 2 test, and another one is called an ERMI test. And you can take them and send them into the lab, and they kind of analyze the dust and particles from your house. And then, if you find the results need to be interpreted in context because 25% of the population has a human leukocyte antigen genotype where their immune system doesn't recognize mold or Lyme toxins, and so they can't detox them. So, if you have 100 people in the room, 75 may not be affected by that level of mold. But if you have one of those genotypes, your normal or your optimal may need to be a lot lower than someone without it. Mm-hmm. And so, this is completely separate from a mold allergy. So we're talking about toxicity here where these lipophilic, fat-soluble toxins are building up in the brain and in the gallbladder and liver, and your immune system doesn't recognize them, so there's no antibody binding to them. So in order to get them out, you have to use binders, certain IV methods that you can use, and saunas can sometimes help. But you have to obviously get rid of the exposure, keep the humidity in your house, 50% or less. Make sure you have some, if you live in a high humidity area, at least 2 dehumidifiers underneath your house, that you get the ductwork clean. You can use special filters in the vents to prevent mold spores from coming in. And then there's, different high-end air filters out there, HEPA filters that you can use inside in case some mold does get in, then it can filter it. So mold, how you ask kind of how does it contribute to chronic fatigue? One way is that it disrupts all your hormones. So it throws off your sex hormones, cortisol, pregnenolone, aldosterone, ADH, all of those. The mycotoxins, they get inside your cells and they disrupt the redox status. So the oxidation and reduction, the electrons being added and taken away, get that system is interfered with by mycotoxins. And specifically, the mitochondria are damaged. And if you are impairing the mitochondria, then you slow down ATP production, and that slows down how well the tissues are able to detox. So most people, they don't realize that, in order to detox, it actually takes a lot of energy, just like digesting your food takes a lot of energy. And so you may have to actually build up your energy in order to properly detox. Other ways that mold contributes to fatigue is that it lowers that hormone I mentioned earlier, alpha melanocyte stimulating hormone. And that hormone is sort of your natural endogenous opioid. So you're going to have more pain because you have lower levels of that hormone. Your sleep won't be as good if you can sleep at all. It's going to affect downstream sex hormones, like I mentioned, and a lot of other things. And typically removing the exposure, the contaminants, will help the alpha MSH go back up. Sometimes it won't. Unfortunately, in the U.S., they've outlawed alpha MSH as a prescription because it was too helpful. But it's an important hormone a lot of people haven't heard of. And then the inflammation, these pro-inflammatory cytokines that the immune system releases, damages hormone receptors, especially insulin receptors. So you can have someone that's insulin resistant that's not eating a lot of sugar or carbs, and it's working out and going to bed on time and all those things. But if there's a lot of inflammation and oxidative stress in the body, that can create insulin resistance. And then insulin is pro-inflammatory. It shuts down a lot of your liver detox pathways. So it's just a vicious cycle that keeps going and going.
Yeah. And so what can someone do? So you mentioned the steps that you take when you are working with clients with chronic fatigue. You said the gut is the first step. Can you kind of elaborate a little bit more about how you go about addressing chronic fatigue? Because I know there's so many people. I have some clients that have been to 20 doctors by the time that they get to me or someone like you. And the doctors really don't have a lot of answers except giving people hormone replacement therapy, or here's some thyroid hormones, or they just give them some medications that ultimately do not address the underlying cause of the problem. So what's the step-by-step that you take?
Well, I kind of address the gut and adrenals at the same time, or I may even address the adrenals first, because if they've had ongoing HPA, adrenal activation, you're gonna have a hard time healing their gut with an imbalanced HPA. So I'll do an adrenal stress index, optimize cortisol and DHEA levels, make sure cortisol is highest in the morning, lowest in the evening, make sure DHEA is towards the optimal end because that's such an important hormone for healing. And then as far as stool testing goes, there's the CDSA, the Comprehensive Digestive Stool Analysis. Problem with that test is that it tries to culture microbes in the lab that are anaerobic. So when they're exposed to oxygen in the ambient air, they die off, and then you can get a false negative report. So the more accurate method is the PCR DNA probe method, where they look for the DNA of the different microbes and protozoa and bacteria and yeast. It doesn't matter if they're alive or dead, it's going to pick them up. And so none of the tests are perfect, but PCR in general is going to be more accurate. And also considering things in context, because if you have someone who's immunocompromised enough, they may have normal levels of certain bacteria that their immune system is reacting to. So it's an inflammatory dysbiosis that often leads to reactive arthritis. But balancing out the good to bad bacteria is extremely important, and correcting the digestive sequencing. So a lot of people, they'll just take probiotics or digestive enzymes, but the cascade starts in the stomach with the production of stomach acid, then that triggers the production of bile, which triggers the production of pancreatic enzymes. So if you just kind of skip those steps and jump into taking enzymes, you may be better off starting at the top and optimizing your stomach acid, which can be low if you're low in zinc, if you're in a sympathetic dominant state, if the thyroid is low, iodine's low, selenium's low, those can all lower your stomach acid production.
Yeah, and
Um,
mercury is a proton pump inhibitor, and so if you have mercury
yeah,
toxicity, that will lower stomach acid as well.
right, exactly. So mercury interferes with it, and I'm sure there's plenty of others, but in general, I try to work on healing the gut mucosa because typically it's inflamed first. I use a variety of nutrients and herbs to kind of help heal that. Then I'll layer in supplementation with betaine, HCl, with pepsin, so that I'm not just kind of throwing gasoline on the fire here. And we also started addressing around that time the infections in the biofilm as well. So I'll use a biofilm disruptor along with certain, antimicrobials or homeopathics to, address the different infections. But I also make it a point to reboot their secretory IgA system because, even if you put the good bacteria there and get rid of the bad bacteria, if that secretory IgA is low, it's a good chance the infections will return. So optimizing the adrenals can help with the secretory IgA. Things like meditation, listening to classical music, those can help as well. Anything that kind of puts you in that parasympathetic state will be of great help in terms of healing the gut. So a lot of times I'll work on the gut and the adrenals at the same time because if people have been trying to heal their gut for a while and it hasn't been working, it tells me there are other factors influencing it. And that kind of goes back to the mold a little bit too, and the Lyme, that alpha MSH hormone. It's important for digestive health and healing the gut mucosa. So when it's low, it can have negative consequences in the gastrointestinal system.
Mm-hmm.
So those are typically the two systems I work on to begin with. Then once someone's more stabilized, I move on to drainage remedies, and we start attacking the various infections that they have and trying to rebalance the immune system. Sometime in the short term, I'll give them supplements to boost testosterone or estrogen or progesterone just because they need it. But ultimately we're working towards the goal of having their body produce it.
Yeah. Yeah, and so how long do you find that it takes someone to recover from chronic fatigue, or can people completely recover from it?
Yeah, they can. It just depends on the person and what all they have going on, how compliant they are, how well their body tolerates the supplements. Because if you start a gentle drainage remedy and someone's reacting to that, then you certainly can't do heavy duty things like chelation and stuff like that. So some people are at the point that they're so reactive, you have to kind of calm them down and stabilize their system before you can even begin working on things. But I mean, a lot of people will see, very positive changes within, 6 to 8 weeks just by working on the adrenals and gut health. And, if you heal the gut lining, you're going to heal the blood-brain barrier. They'll notice, some improvement in brain fog. If we can properly address the infections in the gut and any systemic infections, that's going to also turn down those hyper-excited neurons that are overfiring in the brain, the microglial cells, and that's kind of how low-dose naltrexone works. Is it turns off the microglial cells, and that's why people will say, "Oh, they'll take it," and they'll say, "I feel smarter," or I can concentrate better because they don't have that constant inflammatory reaction going on in the brain.
Mm-hmm. And
And so,
less pain as well.
yeah, less pain, right? So you get less central sensitization of those neural pain pathways. But yeah, so we work on all those different methods, and it's all about layering, peeling away the layers of an onion. So a lot of times people will develop new symptoms, but I tell them that may not mean they're getting worse. It may just mean that we've finished working on layer one and now we're on layer two or layer three.
Yeah, and that's very important for people to remember is when they're healing their body, many people do feel worse before they get better. And this is a concept I think a lot of people don't realize because they want to go to their doctor and get a pill to feel better. They want relief of their symptoms. But sometimes when you're healing your body naturally and you're actually getting to the root cause of the problem, the very issue that is causing your problem, like if you're your immune system's having to heal a gut infection, or you're detoxing mercury, which is the cause of your symptoms, when these things are being flared up and addressed in the body, they can intensify the very symptoms which you're trying to get rid of. So you have to remember that when you're in this healing process, that many times you do feel fatigue and you do have a flare-up of symptoms, and that's okay. That's not something to be scared of, or that's not time to go to a new practitioner who's going to make you feel better.
Right.
You have to kind of, feel worse before you feel better.
Right.
Many times.
Yeah, it's a good point.
Very often.
Absolutely.
And so you're going to give our listeners a special offer to work with you. Can you talk a little about that?
Yeah, so my initial consultation is an hour to an hour and 10 minutes, and it's usually $350. But if your listeners contact me and use the code TWJ81, they'll get $50 off the initial consult, so $300 instead of $350. I also have a year-long program where people work with me. Includes 5 consults. It's called the Heal Your Body program, and they can apply that $50 to that program as well.
Is there anything else that you want to add about chronic fatigue?
No, I think we covered it. I mean, there's so many aspects to it, and you can have 100 people standing in a line with chronic fatigue syndrome, and this person's primary issue may be metals, whereas this person's may be gut related, whereas the next person may be hormonal related. And so, I think it's important to look at all the systems, but the percent contribution that they make to that person's symptoms is going to be different from person to person.
And I think it's also very important to remind listeners out there that if you are tired and you find that you're tired every day when you wake up, that is a warning signal for you not to drink coffee all day long, but that is the beginning of the end, so to speak. I don't want to be so dramatic about it, but that's kind of the beginning. It's a warning sign that something is amiss in your body, and it's probably a good idea to determine what that is before you spend years drinking coffee and developing a chronic illness down the line, and you have permanent damage, which at some point may not be able to be reversed or improved.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I agree 100% with you.
I have a question I like to ask all of my guests. What do you think is the most pressing health issue in the world today?
I think probably immune system imbalances, because if you look at so many disorders, they either are directly affected by or indirectly affected by immune imbalances. So if you have stealth infections that come on board, that leads to pregnenolone steal and sometimes progesterone steal in women, so it alters your hormonal pathways. It causes insulin resistance. It causes a leaky blood-brain barrier. It can cause leaky gut. It's going to interfere. The more inflammation you have, the more it's going to interfere with your detoxification pathways. So, if you put me on an island and said you can only work on one system in the body, I would say make it the immune system, because it's going to negatively affect hormones, gut health, brain health, heart health. There's a virus, for example, Coxsackie-B type 4, that if you have it, it increases your risk of heart disease by about 33%. But how many cardiologists test for viral infections? Almost none. Mm-hmm. So I would say, definitely try to keep your immune system optimal is a major factor.
Yeah, and I just did a really interesting podcast with a sleep physician, and he said that if you are not getting adequate sleep, your body steals energy from your immune system to compensate if you're trying to push yourself, and you have to get that energy from somewhere. So one of the best ways to just take care of your immune system is to just sleep. It's one of the easiest things that you can do. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Well, Tim, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. That was so informative, and I've heard you on the Bulletproof podcast and other podcasts, and I always get so much out of your work and your podcasts that you've done, and I just really wanted to have you on the show because you're a fantastic guest, very, very knowledgeable.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I enjoyed it.
And so,
it was helpful.
Yeah. So, why don't you tell the listeners where they can find you?
Yeah, so www.healyourbody.org is my website. My professional Facebook page is Dr. Tim Jackson. My email is drtim072981@gmail.com. Dr. Tim, all lowercase, 072981@gmail.com. You can email me that way, and I'll be happy to respond.
And what part of the country are you located in?
In South Carolina.
Okay, nice, nice. And so clients can work remotely with you, correct?
Yeah, virtual. So I have clients all over the country, all over the world. So I work with people from all over.
Yeah. Well, fantastic. Well, listeners, if you guys are suffering from any chronic illness or chronic fatigue, definitely look up Dr. Tim Jackson. He's fantastic.
Thank you.
And listeners, if you want to learn more about me, you can go to liveto110.com, and you can learn all about my healing and detox program at mineralpower.com. I have a new website going up soon for that. And thank you so much for listening to the Live to 110 podcast. Dr. Washington, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Wendy.
Why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background?
Right. I'm a family physician. I'm a fellow in the Academy of Family Physicians. I graduated from Stanford's medical school, and for the past 30 years, I've been practicing medicine in the Silicon Valley of the high-tech region in California.
And so you practice family medicine in Silicon Valley, where the tech industry culture encourages innovation and entrepreneurial spirit over sleeping. So
Right.
what did all your clients that were the .comers have in common that led them to get sick?
Well, when I started off treating patients, like most doctors, I would focus on their illness. I would help them to get better. But my passion became to try to figure out what it was about their behavior. Was it stress? Was it exercise or the lack of it? What were about their attitudes could it be that might be contributing to their becoming ill over and over? And what I learned as a result of talking to these can-do kinds of people here in the Silicon Valley is that there's a cycle of illness. And rather than it being stress, as most people focus on, or genes and germs, it turns out the most critical factor with regard to why people get sick when they do is the lack of sufficient sleep.
Yeah. Yeah, and so in your book, Lack of Sufficient Sleep Matters, you illustrate how people will borrow energy by shortchanging themselves when it comes to rejuvenating sleep. So how did you
Right.
conclude that this is the single most important common cause of people getting sick?
Well, as it turns out, it appears when I interview people after their illness, right? They come to see me, I treat them, and in their follow-up, when we can talk about it, what I've found is that the can-do kind of people that I interview talk about the fact that when they have something that there's a challenge or what most people might consider to be a stress, and they make up their mind that they're going to accomplish it, they're going to get it done, something peculiar happens to them. They describe getting a sense of extra energy to get done what they want to do. They feel more confident, more creative, they have more energy to get things done. There's a host of characteristics that happen. But when I ask them, well, are you stressed at that time? They say, well, I'm not really sure what you mean by stressed. I just have to get it done. And it's not just the engineers, single mothers. There are a lot of people. They tend to be the alpha people of the world who, when they make up their mind they're going to get something done, they get extra energy. But I don't think it's extra. I think what they're doing is they're borrowing energy from their immune system because